Okay, welcome to Candid Conversation number 540. Today's question in Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the end times for Israel's program, things that will happen just before Jesus' second coming. And in Matthew 24, verse 12, it says, quote, "And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold," end quote. And the question is, what does that mean? The love of many shall wax cold. Well, what it means is that you have what you see in Romans 1 with the reprobate mind. It says that in the end, at first, when they don't want to retain God in their knowledge, then they commit sexual sin with the opposite sex. And then, as they go further down the downward spiral of sin, they commit sexual sin with the same sex. And then finally, because iniquity abounds, then God gives them over to a reprobate mind so that they don't think of God at all. And it says there in Romans 1:28 and following, being filled with all unrighteousness. And it talks about all the evil things that they do. And what this shows is there is a correlation between recognizing God, believing God and His Word, and love. That's what people don't understand, is that they think, oh, that old Bible, that's just a fairy tale. God doesn't really exist. All those stories are just myths. They're the crutch that some people have to lean on. But what you see in society is that, as Jesus says, now I understand Matthew 24:12 is not being fulfilled today because this is for Israel's program. But it says, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. So it means that people are just selfish. When it talks about being given over to a reprobate mind there in Romans 1:28, being filled with all unrighteousness, they don't listen to anybody, including the parents. It says, and they're disobedient to parents. They don't listen to anybody. They only seek their own interest. And so there is no love for fellow man. The thing that's going to make hell bad isn't the fire, which I'm sure the fire is going to be tormenting. The rich man in Luke 16 says, oh, get Lazarus to just dip my tongue in some cool water. I'm tormented in the flame. The worst part of hell is the absence of love. 1 John 4:8 says God is love. He defines what love is. The best definition of love is God. And we, for all eternity, will be experiencing God's love and sharing God's love in heavenly places. But if you're in hell, then you're absent from that love of God. And that's where the torment comes. And you can see in society, the society that I grew up in the 80s, there was a lot more love for the fellow man back then than you see today in 2020. Back then, people would do things. They'd be nice to each other at least. They would help each other out. Especially like we had a hurricane come through almost 2 months ago. And there was a lot of damage, things that happened. Well, a lot of that stuff, it's still almost 2 months and there's still debris and things around here. Why? Because no one helps out. And then you try to get something like, say, a big tree falls on your house. Well, it's big, you're not able to take it off your house. So then there are people gouging others. There are people that pay $10,000 to get a tree removed and, taken off of their house and removed from their property. $10,000. There's all this price gouging. The price of shingles for roofs has doubled. They're just taking advantage of everybody. See, the love of many shall wax cold. It just means that there is no love for fellow man. All love comes from God. And when you don't recognize that God exists, you're atheist, and you're given over to a reprobate mind. We've already seen in this United States society that in the 50s and 60s there was the free love, 1950s and 60s, and that free love would be the sexual sin with the opposite sex. And then we've seen the sodomites come to the forefront in the 90s and 2000s, and now it's homosexual marriage is accepted and it's seen as a norm. And who are you to judge them? And so now that that's accepted, it's only natural then we go over to God giving us over to a reprobate mind. And so now you live in a society where there is no love, really. The only time they treat you well, people treat you well, is because they want something from you. And so that's where we are today. And it's now, again, the Matthew 24 passage is referring to the end times just before Jesus' second coming, but that's not going to happen all at once. So you have to have a progression of things to get to that point where the love of many shall wax cold. But notice it says, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. And that shows how important it is to believe there's a God, that the Bible is true, to recognize your sin, trust in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for your sin, and get sound doctrine built up in your inner man. Because then you have Christ's love coming through you to others. And now that we're in a society that rejects God and His Word, the only people that really, for the most part, the only people that go to church are just doing it to look good to others, to get ahead. Just like I say in society, if you go to a restaurant, a waitress is going to usually treat you nice. Well, that's because she wants a tip. It's not because she genuinely loves you. She's going to smile and act all nice because then maybe she'll get $5 instead of $2. So she treats you nice that way. And so that's the same thing when it comes to how people are when it comes to God. They don't believe God and His Word. They're not saved. They're not believing the gospel. But they just go to church to look good to their community, to get a political position, to network, to ease a guilty conscience, to look good to the family, to their kids, whatever it is. Because if you ask those people, just ask them, what was the sermon on today? Oh, we had a good service, but what was the sermon on? Usually they can't even tell you what was on, much less learn anything about it. And of course the pastor didn't use scripture or use very little. And so it just shows that we are in that period. And again, the Matthew 24 is a reference to Israel's program, but you can read 2 Timothy chapter 3, and it gives a list. It says, in the last days, meaning in the last days before the rapture, the last days of the body of Christ, it says, perilous times shall come. It says, men will be lovers of themselves. It says they will love pleasure more than lovers of God. And you can just see this in society as time has gone on. Abortions become legalized almost 50 years ago. Millions of babies have been killed. So now today, millions of elderly people are put in rest homes. They're drugged up and they don't do anything to them. So the younger ones in society are killed through abortions. The older ones in society are just holed up in some facility, drugged up, not knowing that they even exist. And then they're abandoned. You don't see family coming around to even visit them, much less take care of them. They're just a liability to the family. And then you got the people in the middle there, the wage earners, controlling everything and doing whatever they want to do. And so they just follow pleasures. They go out and get drunk. They do whatever their sinful desires are, as Romans 1:28 says, filled with all unrighteousness. And you don't see God being honored, and so that's why iniquity abounds. So it's a cycle of God is love. So when man decides there is no God, or I don't recognize God, or I am my own God, or I form God into my own image, which is what the church people do nowadays, then the result is there is no love in them. And because they have rejected God and didn't like to retain the knowledge of God within them, then iniquity abounds, because God has given every man the law of the conscience. And if you recognize that, then you at least try to obey that, do good by that, which is what society did 40 years ago when I was growing up. And so the society was, again, there may not have been a whole lot of people going to heaven who have believed the clear gospel, but at least they operate by the conscience and they try to do right by their fellow man. They try to be a good person. And that makes society work better. But now, because they've rejected God, they don't even believe he exists, so then they don't like to retain him in the knowledge of God in their mind, so they're given over to a reprobate mind. And since God is love, then there is no love in them. So then all they do is commit iniquity. Iniquity is rebellion against God, and they rebel against God because they create their own rules, and then they follow those rather than following God. They have no conscience. Ephesians 4 talks about being filled with all unrighteousness, and how they work all, Romans 1:28 says that, but Ephesians 4 says how they work all uncleanness with greediness. And so that's how the society gets worse. That's that downward spiral of sin. It just gets worse and worse. So they reject the knowledge of God in their mind. So since God is love, there is no love within them. And then they just do whatever their sinful desires are, because they have a sin nature, so they follow that. And that's how they are. Iniquity abounds, and the love of many wax cold. And I just think of the things that have happened in society, how they put in abortion, and now they put in all these nursing homes for the elderly. It used to be you'd have an elderly mother or father, and you take care of them at your house. But now it's, lock them up, basically, put them in prison, and drug them up so they can't say anything about it. Putting them in that nursing home. Then you look at things like taking prayer out of schools. And again, I understand the schools weren't teaching right division, and they may not have been teaching a clear gospel. But you go back 140 years or so, and most all schools, public schools, used the Bible as their main text. And they learned, of course, reading and arithmetic and all those different subjects through science. You can learn history. You can learn a lot of that stuff all in the Bible. And they at least had a God conscience. They retained God in their mind, and so then society functioned well. So now we take the Bible out of schools, we take prayer out of schools, we start abortions, and then the sodomy that's happened. You notice the big sins in Romans 1 that lead to the downward spiral of sin, in which you're given over to a reprobate mind, or sexual sins. First it's with the opposite sex, then it's with the same sex. And that's because sexual sin, according to 1 Corinthians 6, is the only sin that you can commit against your own body. And so then that way what you're doing is you're taking the knowledge of God out of your mind when you commit sexual sin, because then you make yourself to be God. Sex is a union between two people, and so a part of you goes to that other person when you have sex. And so when you commit sexual sin, then you're losing a part of that God consciousness, the law of the conscience. You're losing a part of that when you commit this sexual sin, and then it results finally in the reprobate mind. And that's why Satan pushes the sexual sins. And that's why before, if someone robbed a bank and you said you're guilty of committing a sin, they wouldn't say, well, who are you to judge me? It's okay to me. I can rob a bank if I want to. They don't do that. But when it comes to sodomy, and you call that out, oh, who are you to judge me? Or the transgenders, who are you to judge me? When it comes to that type of stuff, and you can't, it's like you have freedom of speech unless you speak out against sexual sin that is done by people. And then it's, oh, you have no right to judge me. Well, what they're saying then is, I am my own God. If I can judge somebody, if someone robs a bank, and I judge that as stealing, and I judge that as a sin. It's not really me saying, oh, you've committed a sin. It's the law of the conscience. It's God saying. God said in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal. And so I'm not passing my judgment on you. I'm not being God. I'm just telling you what God says about stealing, that it's wrong. It's a sin. And so what I'm doing is I'm reminding you that you went against God's law. But then if someone commits sin with the opposite sex or with the same sex or the transgender stuff, and they say, well, who are you to judge me? When you call that out, well, now people aren't calling that out. So what they're doing is they're not reminding the other person of God's law of the conscience, that the sexual sin that they're committing is a sin. And so then what that does, then it makes that person, it gets the law of God or the conscience out of that person's mind to the point that they think what they're doing is perfectly okay. And so then they are God themselves. And so then what that does is it gets rid of God, and so the iniquity abounds, and then the love of many shall wax cold. It's interesting that the Sodomites are usually the most hateful people you will ever meet. Well, it's because they have rejected God's love by rejecting the law of God in their conscience. You know, at least the person who steals from the bank knows that he's doing wrong, and he may justify it by saying, well, I got to feed my family, or I got this gambling debt I got to take care of, or whatever it is, whatever the reason is they robbed the bank. They at least recognize it's wrong, but then they try to come up with an excuse to justify their behavior. But with the sexual sin, they don't even admit that they're wrong, and they say, who are you to judge me? So then it gets rid of the God consciousness in their hearts. And this is not something that's new. You look in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah with Lot, and that's exactly what they told him. When you had the two angels came, God sent these two angels to judge the Sodom and Gomorrah to see, if God should destroy it, or if there are enough righteous people in it to save it. And of course it ended up being destroyed. But when the two men were at Lot's house, you had the men from all over the city came and said, bring these two men out to us that we may know them. So they wanted to have sodomite sex with these two men or angels that were in Lot's house. And Lot was trying to say, well, no, they're my guests, don't do anything. And the men say, well, this man comes and he lives among us, and now he's going to be our judge. That's exactly what the Sodomites do today. They say, who are you to judge me? You have no right to judge me. It shows, because sexual sin is a sin against your own body, in order to keep doing it, you have to make yourself God. That's why I say you lose part of that God consciousness every time you commit sexual sin. So you have to make yourself God and reject the consciousness of God in you that it's a sin, since it's a sin against your own body, whereas stealing isn't. Stealing is still a sin, but not against your own body. And so then the natural reaction in Sodom and Gomorrah's day and in today's day is, who are you to judge me? You have no right to judge me. And so that's the primary reason why, iniquity abounds and the love of many wax cold. So it simply just means that in a society where they have rejected God, the consciousness that God has given them, those rules, and they have decided to do whatever their heart's desire is, then they are given over to a reprobate mind, they are filled with all unrighteousness, and so they ended up, iniquity abounds, because there's no check against the iniquity. And sodomy does that as well, because one of the checks against there are three checks that God designed against the sin nature. First is marriage, because the opposite sex has a different mind than you do, so it checks your sin nature. And then the second is kids. You want to do good for your kids. And then the third is nationalism. And so what happens in an advanced society like we're in today is you don't have the marriage check because people are shacking up with the same sex, or if they're with the opposite sex, they're not staying that long, they're not marrying. And then you don't have the check of the family because obviously in those situations you don't have kids. And then you don't have the check of nationalism because the nation then decides that sodomy is okay. And so with all the checks of against free will being removed, and it all has to do with sexual sin, then you have replaced God and now you are God in your own mind, and then you do whatever you want. There is no check there. And so God gives you over to a reprobate mind. God gives you what you want. If you wanted to continue to sin and reject God, he says, fine, I'll leave you alone. Go ahead into your own utter depravity. And so then iniquity abounds, and because God is love and God has been removed from everybody's conscience, then the love of many wax cold. Thanks for watching.